Hello, so this is the third video and there's a couple of things to get through, so I'll try and do it quickly because I know get distracted if the videos are too long. So I'm going to go through the concepts quickly. So now we've talked about a measure of the size of the economy. Now we've talked about that in dollar terms, but there is a fundamental problem with that because dollars have different value over different times. Um, you talk about, oh, they only used to earn, $10 a week in 1960. And it's, oh, how terrible. But obviously, $10 in 1960 is very different from $10 in 2025. And so this is the difference between nominal values and real values. A nominal value is an economic statistic actually announced at the time, not adjusted for inflation. So, for example, the U.S. economy may have been, in 1960, the GDP might have been $1 billion in 1960 dollars. But because maybe everything's about 5 or 6 times the price these days, that in 2025 dollars, that might have been, say, $6 trillion. And so we have to find a metric by which we can compare especially the US economy over time. And we do that by adjusting the past, present, and future GDP figures or projections to a particular year's dollars, so that then we have a standard for comparing them. And so nominal GDP, as we'll see, has been, like say, for example, in 1970, the size of the US economy was like 2 trillion. Now it's 22 trillion. Now, is the economy from in 2020 what 11 times the size of the economy in 1970? It's a lot bigger, but it's certainly not 11 times the size because obviously the value of the dollar in 2020 is less than the value of a dollar in 1970. Um, and so we've got to find some way of making those figures from the earlier times um, be able to speak to the figures in 2020 by, in a way, adjusting the earlier figures to maybe 2020 dollars or some standard where we can measure them in a way that we're actually comparing like for like. Um, so what we need to do is find what's called the GDP deflator. And that's where we sort of say, okay, at a particular year, we say that we a particular year, let's say, for example, 2010, and we say 2010 is 100, or in this, it's actually 2015 is 100. So we're talking about 2015 dollars. So anything that is sort of after 2015, we in a way adjust it down because we're assuming this is going up all the time. So we sort of adjust the figures down if we want to make it into 2015 dollars, and everything below we're raising it up because we're saying that anything in reality, like in 1960, the the value of everything in 1960 was 18% of the value in 2015. So in a sense, we have to sort of inflate, or we need we think about the other way around. We have to put 100 over 18, 100 over 18, and okay, 100 over 18, and then we would be able to inflate those figures so they become like 2015 dollars. Yes, and so what we do is we put real GDP equals nominal GDP over the price index divided by 100 to turn it sort of into a percentage change. And so the price index is the same as a GDP inflator. So for example, if we said in that 1960 it was 18, that means we would take the nominal GDP of 1960, we'd put that, if we want to change it into 2015 dollars, we'd put the GDP inflator in there in the place of the price index. That would be 18 over 100. And if you think about it, that would then inflate that figure to make it into dollars of 2015. You know? Um, um, yeah, so always remember there's going to be a base period which is going to be 100, and that you would then, the difference between that base year and the original year will be the price index or the GDP deflator, and we'll use that to turn nominal GDP figures into real GDP figures. This can be a little bit sort of tricky mathematically, but once you've done it a few times, you'll get it. And so let's try and sort of do an example of it. Um, um, this is not. Um, okay, so it's okay. So this is it's those black squares should be covering up various things, but try and work out these sort of figures in each year, because in 1960 it's actually 19. So to turn nominal GDP into real GDP based on sort of 2015 dollars, or sorry, in this case it's a 2005 is the base year. Um, that so um, if we wanted to turn 1960 into 2005 dollars, we'd have to put the nominal GDP, which was half a trillion, 543.3 billion, over 19 over 100. So then that will cause the real GDP to inflate, and that will go up to nearly 3 trillion. 2005 is obviously the base year, so nominal GDP equals real GDP. But then if you wanted to compare 2010 with, say, 1960, you'd get 2010 and convert that into 2005 dollars. And so what would happen is the GDP, you would have the nominal GDP, which is nearly 15 trillion, and then it would be put over 110 over 100, and that would in a way deflate the figures. Unfortunately, we can't, but just try and do the calculations there and you'll get it. And so yeah, this is sort of how it's happening. So do those figures, try to do those figures for yourself, and you'll see and you'll understand, you know. So real GDP has generally is going to be sort of so in real dollars, so real GDP will tend to be higher when we look at the past. Obviously, inflation got very low after the 2008 crash, and so that sort of sent it the other way. But past nominal GDP will normally be sort of will be lower than real GDP, because obviously all past values, we've got to inflate the value of the dollars that have been spent. Now, here's another calculation. This is all a little bit about calculations this week. It's a little bit difficult to sort of teach you these things. You just got to do them yourself to a certain extent. Is to think about what's the change in the real GDP growth rate. So, and generally, if you want, you first, with any change in real GDP growth rate, first you've got to find the real GDP, which you get from doing the whole dividing the nominal GDP by the price index or GDP deflator, divide by 100. And then you get the two real GDPs, and then you minus one from the other, and obviously times it by 100, and you get the percentage change. And so The question is, what was the real GDP growth rate from 1960 to 2012? For some reason, they put the 2020 real GDP, but let's say that would be 13. We win, well, 2012, it was 13,598 minus 5. And then you minus that from the real GDP there. And then you times that by 100. And then that would be so we can see that the real GDP between 1960 and 2012 has gone up by 376% or nearly 4 times. And these sort of changes in the growth rate of the economy are an important thing to work out, and there'll be exam questions on this. If you're confused, let's talk about it in class on Tuesday. And this is something we're going to be talking about a lot. This leads to the whole concept of the business cycle. We want to look at how much the GDP is growing. That becomes a very, very important thing, because often, really, the first thing that the voters are looking for is has the economy grown or not? Because you can feel it. If the economy is growing, you can feel it as new jobs, wages going up, things are positive, and there's more things in the shops, stuff like that. If the economy is not growing, then you can feel it as well. So often when the economy is not growing, when there's a significant decline or it's flatlining the national output GDP, that's a recession. When it's really deep, a really deep recession becomes a depression. And we'll be talking about this more and more over the coming weeks. Now, the interesting thing with the US, if you look at the last 90 years, the economy of the US has just grown. It's just grown in real terms. If you look at the US economy in 1960, in real terms, it was about 3 trillion. Now it's approaching 20 trillion. In fact, if you go to 2025, we're talking about 28, 29 trillion. So really, you guys are nearly approaching 10 times better off than people that were in the 1960s or the early in 1960. But in the midst of that, there's all these ups and downs. There's what's called peaks when the economy gets into a boom, and dips when it goes into a recession and eventually a depression. These are often called peaks and troughs, and we'll talk about that. As we move along, they're a very key part of the macro economy. So basically, during the business cycle, and the business cycle is this means by which the capitalist system seems to rise and then seems to fall, seems to rise and then seems to fall, and we'll look at the reasons for that. And so during the business cycle, the highest point of output before a recession begins is a peak, and then it starts to go down. And during the business cycle, the lowest point of output in a recession, the trough is where it gets to the bottom of that negative business cycle. A recession pushes you towards a trough, and then that will eventually move upwards towards an expansion or a boom. So a recession lasts from peak to trough, and an economic upswing runs from trough to peak. So from the peak down to the trough is the sort of recession, but the upswing or the expansion or the boom is what goes from the trough, the bottom, to the peak. And the business cycle is this relatively short-term movement in and out of recession. But you see, the business cycle is not the whole thing. The US economy over time goes up and down, but its general trajectory is upwards. Okay, so that's how we compare the GDP over time based on adjusting it for inflation. So that there's a lot of little calculations there that you've really just got to do. Once you do them a few times with your sort of pencil and paper, you'll get it, But the other calculations we have to do is to compare GDP among countries. And again, the US uses dollars. Mexico uses pesos. Canada uses Canadian dollars. The UK uses British pound sterling. The Eurozone uses the euro. So how do we sort of change the dollar values into the values of other currencies, or change the values of other currencies into dollar values, so you can compare the relative size of the economy? When we talk about the size of the Chinese economy, we say $19 trillion. But obviously, they don't use dollars in China. So what we've done there is converted Chinese yuan into dollars. And how do we do that? We have to use the exchange rate, which is the value or price of one currency in terms of another currency. So let's imagine that we wanted to compare GDP in 2020, or in Brazil's GDP was 2020, or was 7.4 trillion reals, Brazilian reals, and the US GDP was $20.9 trillion. In 2020, the exchange rate was 2.362 reals to the dollar. And so what we do is we put to find Brazilian GDP in US dollars, we put the Brazilian GDP in reals and put that over the exchange rate. So it's the first, so you've got the Brazilian GDP, the foreign GDP in their currency over the exchange rate of that currency with the dollar. So we put we know that 2.36, so we put 7.4 over 2.362 because it's over $1, which, that sort of cancels out. So it's just a matter of 7.4 trillion being divided by 2.362, which means that Brazil had a GDP of 3.1 trillion American dollars, which is, a big GDP. But it also means that you can say that the US economy is 7 times the size of the Brazilian economy. Now, but I was just about to say, well, but then there's twice as many Americans as there are Brazilians. Brazil's a big country. It's 200 million people, or 190, something like that. And that's sort of nearly, but then the US is like, what, 330, 340 million. So, and you see, oh yeah, China's got a GDP of $19 trillion, where, somewhere like, I don't know, France has got a GDP of a lot less than that. But then obviously there's much more people in China than there are in France. So does it mean that every Chinese person is rich? No. The way we can sort of try and get a sense of how well off the average person is by the measure of GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is GDP over the population. And so that measures what is called basically how well people are off, how well they are off economically. But it doesn't totally measure the standard of living, because obviously, money is very important, but money isn't everything. So GDP doesn't include people's leisure time. The US is very well off relative to people in say, Europe. But then US people, the average US person works a lot harder than the average person in Europe, Obviously, actual levels of environmental cleanliness, health, and learning, that's part of the standard. Production that is not exchanged in the market, that's a measure of the sort of communal life. That's not in the standard of living. Obviously, inequality, GDP per capita could be very high, but that could mask significant levels of inequality. And then obviously the infrastructure, the technology, the products that are available are a big part of the standard of living. So GDP is a very good measure and a very simple measure of comparing societies, but it's not, it's not everything. Okay, so I hope that helps. I know there's a lot of little sort of sort of equations to learn and calculations to learn. I just recommend that you just try to do them on the quizzes and even do the ones that are on the slides. And that once you've done those a few times, you'll get them. Okay, excellent. So I'll see you on Tuesday, but email me if you've got any questions.